Okay, hey guys, so I have a question for you. When exactly did modern Yu-Gi-Oh actually begin? And this is actually a really serious question that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few months. We all use the term like modern Yu-Gi-Oh, and we all kind of have the same general idea of what that means. There's kind of a point in Yu-Gi-Oh where things were different. Some people would characterize modern Yu-Gi-Oh by things like long combos or hand traps, omni negates, extenders and games ending really quickly, that sort of thing. And we know like old school Yu-Gi-Oh was when the game was slower, when maybe it was more like, oh, it felt more like playing chess, or they didn't have all these crazy, combos and stuff like that. I'm not really here to debate which one's better or worse. That's not really the point of this video. I'm more so here to look at certain points in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, certain sort of card design philosophies or the releases of certain things in general that sort of steered the boat towards what we know modern Yu-Gi-Oh to be today. And at the end of the video, I really want to hear what you guys think about this one because this is something that I don't think there's like a right or wrong answer. I don't think that it's really as simple as like, okay, this date and time is modern Yu-Gi-Oh. But it's just fun to think about. So yeah, this one will probably be getting into the nitty gritty of things. So I've got some cards here, and I'm going to talk about them. Now, I should go ahead and mention that the cards I'm talking about here aren't like meant to be exact representations of anything. Like they're just a single card example to represent a concept. Okay, so the first card is Tyrus, Keeper of Genesis, and the reason I mention this is actually because of the wind-up deck. This was in 2012. So the wind-up deck was kind of one of the premier, very strong Xyz strategies of the time. Wind-ups were able to spam out, at least for the time, Xyz monsters, and I think that they were the first deck that kind of popularized the idea of the unbreakable board. Now, this was still in its early phases, but it was basically the idea that like you can make a board of monsters that cannot be easily destroyed. Tyrus, Keeper of Genesis being one of them, but there were of course others like Wind Up Zen Mains or Maestro of the Symphony Gen. And by making a board of two or three of these monsters, it was very difficult for your opponent to deal with them. So like Tyrus, for example, here she can't be destroyed by card effects while she has Xyz material, and then also at the end of the battle phase, if she attacked or was attacked, she can detach a material and or destroy a card your opponent controls. She attaches the material at the end of the turn. Okay, so her specific effect isn't like super important in the big scheme of things, but just more so the idea of like a boss monster that you kind of have to work a little harder to deal with, and that you can't use bottomless trap hole on, you can't use dark hole on, you can't use, smashing ground or fissure, that type of card on. Mirror Force even. So getting rid of these boss monsters gets a little bit trickier, and there's a certain amount of stickiness that they have on the field, right? If you have this and you have other monsters that can't be destroyed by card effects, then it sort of means, well, okay, your opponent pretty much can't beat you easily. They have to expend more than you necessarily will on your next turn. So just something to keep in mind. All right, the next card though. Oh yeah, I had Zen mains as well. Just another example of a card that if it'd be destroyed, you can attach a material from it instead, and then it can also like pop a card. I guess I should mention too that like floatiness, where not only does it live but it also pops a card, is sort of important. But yeah, these are the cards that sort of define the wind up age. Okay, next there is the Dragon Ruler era. So this was early 2013, I believe, is when these guys came out. I don't remember the exact set, but I want to say it was like early 2013. And so the Dragon Rulers are very infamous. Everybody talks about them all the time. These are the cards that sort of like did too much. And you can look at this effect text and see this is a lot. There's a lot of stuff here to read. It's got 4 different effects. It's got an effect that can summon itself from your hand or graveyard by banishing cards. There's an effect in the end phase where it bounces back to the hand. There's an effect where you can discard it and an Earth monster to get the Monster Reborn effect. And then if it gets banished, you can add an Earth Dragon monster from your deck to your hand. So clearly there's a lot going on, and I think that these monsters kind of like were the start of an era where monsters have a lot of different effects. Another thing that sort of started to appear here, although didn't get super mainstream until later, is you can only use one Redox Dragon Ruler Boulder's effect per turn, only once that turn. All the Dragon Rulers are like this. So that kind of hard once per turn text that had to get added to cards like this because they had so many effects. Now, later on, we'll see that that becomes more and more of a standard thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! But at the time, this was kind of somewhat new. So just something to keep in mind there. I think that the Dragon Rulers certainly are iconic in that they were sort of seen as like a tier 0 deck. Some people would argue that spell books or whatever were like, equal to them or sort of the anti-meta to them. Not here to debate it, but the point is that these went down in history as very strong Yu-Gi-Oh cards that sort of broke the power ceiling that had existed before them. They could float, they could resummon, they were big beaters, they had useful effects that emulated banned cards like Monster Reborn or Foolish Burial, or Ring of Destruction, or whatever Tempest does. So yeah, basically these were very strong cards, and they all got banned, and then Tempest eventually came off. But to this day, most of the Dragon Rulers are still banned, so I guess that goes to show they definitely left a mark in some way or another. Okay, the next one is the Shaddolls. So this isn't actually the Shaddolls archetype specifically that I'm talking about, but rather the Duelist Alliance set in general, which released both Shaddolls and Burning Abyss, alongside a couple of other things like Satellar Knights that were kind of relevant during the 2014-2015 time. But I wanted to focus specifically on Shaddolls and Burning Abyss because these were sort of the era of monsters that floated really, really hard. By floating, I mean to say when they go to the graveyard, they get an effect. So floaters have existed in Yu-Gi-Oh! For years, right? Like Sangan existed for a long time, Mystic Tomato, Giant Rat. They get destroyed, you get a monster. But the difference with the Shaddol monsters and the Burning Abyss monsters, especially the Burning Abyss monsters, but really both of them, is that when they get sent to the graveyard, just kind of in any way, they get their effects. So most main deck Shadow monsters do have to get sent to the graveyard by a card effect, but of course the archetype's kind of centered around that. Construct can literally get sent in anyway, and she can like recycle spell or trap. But it's these monsters that when they went to the graveyard would just get you, they pay for themselves and more, right? When Graph got sent to the grave, you got to summon a Burning Abyss monster from the deck. So that's sort of something that I feel cards before had float effects, but they always felt kind of reactionary, right? Like with a Mystic Tomato or a Sangan, it was kind of more like your opponent had to hit the monster and kill it, and then it got an effect kind of to pay for your troubles. But these monsters were ones where you could proactively send them to the graveyard with your own set of cards and combos and stuff, and they would get these effects. And that floatiness also translates to matchups where, like, if you were using older cards at the time, it would be difficult to deal with Shaddolls or Burning Abyss because you'd find that your cards are getting expended faster than they're running out of resources. So that's something, and I guess a little small thing to note with Graph here and most of the Burning Abyss monsters. If you control no spell or trap cards, you can special summon this card from your hand. So just kind of keep that in mind, the idea of a monster that can just summon itself from the hand. Now, we had things like Cyber Dragon before, which could summon itself if you have no monsters, your opponent has one. But this is a little bit different. This is a monster that can just summon itself from the hand under pretty much any circumstance. Well, you have to have no spells and traps, but just keep that in mind, right? It's a trend that shows up more and more. So these came out in 2014 and kind of continued to persist for a long time, particularly Burning Abyss. It was actually a relevant deck for many years after its release. Shaddolls got hit a little bit harder on the ban list, so they didn't come back until later. But yeah, so that's kind of an era. And since we're talking about the Duelist Alliance era, while this archetype didn't release in Duelist Alliance, it released, about 6 months later, and that's Necroz. So Necroz is going to be one of these ones that it's a ritual archetype, and it was kind of crazy to think that a ritual archetype could be as strong as Necroz was. But what it did so well is it gave all of the Necroz monsters effects in their hand. So usually these were like effects where you could discard them to do something. In the case of Necroz of Brionic, you could discard it to add any Necroz monster from your deck to your hand. And a similar one was Necroz of Clazolis, which could do the same thing but for Necroz spells and traps, aka their ritual spells for the most part. So, this is important because this kind of shows Konami's new adventure into the idea of like a monster that has an effect in the hand. Now, I'm not so much talking about hand traps, and more so the idea that a monster, even if it's not useful to you, or like in the sense that you can't get it on the field, like say I can't summon Brionic on the turn that I have it, I can still pitch it and get value out of it. And that's something that I think is, we see that a little bit more today. There are a lot of monsters that have effects that you can use just by like pitching them from the hand to get a search or to get a recycle or something like that. And it prevents the cards from being dead. Dead cards were always a thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Where it's like, oh, this card's in my hand and I can't do anything with it. So you wanted to minimize dead cards. But this archetype was one where like these monsters just weren't oftentimes dead because they could do your searching for you. So that's kind of neat. And also another little thing to keep in mind here is notice that this is monsters that are doing the searching. So it's not you using a card like Reinforcement of the Army or, I don't know, Erratic Seal of Convocation, Fire Formation Tinky, something like that to get your searches, but actually monsters that are able to do the searching. Is it a big deal? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, like, I think that it's commonly known now that monsters do a lot of the work in Yu-Gi-Oh! These days. So, just something to keep in mind. Another card of the era that was kind of relevant is Appa Cleefort Towers. So, the Cleefort deck in general was just a really strong sort of pendulum deck, uh, anti-meta, kind of resembled Monarchs. I'm not going to really be talking so much about their strategy as much as the concept of like what Appa Cleefort Towers represented. This sort of represented that whole unaffected boss monster, the boss monster that you just cannot get off the field easily, at least, right? So this came out before Kaijus, and I want you guys to keep that in mind. It is unaffected by spell and trap effects, period. So, no dark hole, no, bottomless trap hole, no torrential tribute, none of that. And by the activated effects from any monster whose original level or rank is lower than this card's current level, which, lo and behold, is like 10. So obviously it's not going to be really affected by much of anything. This card was a really big problem at the time because, like, how do you deal with this? There weren't loads of ways. This is a period of time before we had kaijus. Kaijus did not exist yet. I know normally you guys are thinking, like, oh, I just use Gamma Seal. But at the time, not the case. There was no Gamma Seal. People used cards like Share the Pain to deal with this card, or what was it? Diamond Crab King was an Xyz monster that you could use to kind of deal with it or like ram into it or whatever. But yeah, so Apple Cleefort Towers, it was kind of difficult to make. I mean, you had to tribute 3 Clee monsters or 3 Clee tributes. Some of them could count as 2. To summon it, but that wasn't super hard to do within that deck. Even after the Cleefort deck itself got hit a little bit in the balance, there were like Cleefort Towers Turbo deck that just got this thing out because you could sit on this for a couple turns and your opponent just can't really do anything. And it's also able to force your opponent to send a card from the hand or field to the graveyard each turn. So they're going to quickly run out of resources and you're just going to like smash until like they're dead. So uh we will see more of these types of monsters later on down the line. Obviously, you can probably think of a few because lots of decks get them now. There's like the big Raid Raptor, Ultimate Falcon. It's not affected by things. Today, what is it? Arrival, Cyberus, adding Nister that like can't be affected by stuff, and it's even bigger than this. So yeah, this is sort of the first major one of these boss monsters that existed. Okay, here's another one. Performage Plushfire. So this one's gonna kind of represent pendulums because some people just think pendulums were the start of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Funny enough, pendulums actually began as not a particularly powerful summoning type. Like the ones that came out originally in like Duelist Alliance were not really able to be a deck quite yet, although that changed not it didn't take super long for that to change. Cleeforts came out in like the next set and they were pretty good. But I think that the like sort of Pei deck that everybody calls it with Perform Ages and Performa Pals, it was very consistent. It was kind of the first deck that really did super duper long turns that combined synchro summoning, Xyz summoning, fusion summoning, and pendulum summoning all kind of in one strategy. This card's banned to this day, so that should say something. I don't necessarily know that pendulums were like sort of the beginning of the end, like so many people like to call them, but I do think that pendulums represented a shift in like what was able to be done in a turn because they did have their own sort of set of rules that like only they had, and being able to summon like a lot of monsters at one time was probably like a omen of worse things to come. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think like pendulums necessarily are like what modern Yu-Gi-Oh is, but that extra amount of card text and the rules that apply only to them, you could say that sort of points to something. Okay. Next, this is a really important one that a lot of people will say kind of represents modern Yu-Gi-Oh! The rise of hand traps. Now, hand traps have existed for quite a while. Effect Veiler and Max C were some of the ones that sort of popularized the term before this card got released. And technically, they've existed for as far back as like Karibo. So, there's that. Or even like DD Crow if you want something that kind of feels a little more competitively relevant. The thing is, Ash Blossom, I think, represents a power creep that is not like, I think people understate just how much of a power creep and like power boost just to the game that Ash Blossom truly is. This card can single-handedly shut decks down. You guys know like what she does, but the ability to negate from your hand an effect that adds a card from deck to hand, special summons a monster from the deck, or sends a card from deck to grave means setup cards can be completely shut out with this lone card. In addition to that, she's also got some really useful statistics, like being a level 3 zombie tuner, 1800 defense. Those little things can come up a lot. Effect Veiler was a tuner, so that's not like anything super new here, but it's just like, I think people underestimate just how strong Ash Blossom is because we never really had something like this before. If you were going second in the game and your opponent's going first, I mean, this just gave you something to completely stop them. And while these days Ash Blossom's not like the end all of everything, lots of decks can play around, a single Ash Blossom. At the time, that was not really the case. And even to this day, for a lot of more rogue, like lower tier decks or budget decks, Ash Blossom can just kind of ruin you, right? Like, I mean, you can play Ash Blossom on some tier 4 deck that has like one way to start, and if that thing gets negated, then the deck usually just has to end its turn, and they've probably committed two monsters or two cards or something to like making a link monster, and then it completely shuts things down. This can really kill the fun vibe of like casual sort of lower tier Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's been a staple pretty much since release. So I think this is definitely one of those like emblematic of modern Yu-Gi-Oh things, but not the full story, but just one that I think is a big milestone. Okay, next we've got the Zodiacs. So these released actually like a little bit before Ash Blossom, but yeah, so I use Zodiac Trident to represent it. You could use Rat Pier or others. But Zodiacs basically cheated the Xyz mechanic. They were the first like entire archetype able to do that. There were things that could do it before, but yeah, so Zodiac monsters meant like you could Xyz summon them over just any Zodiac monster you had. You could layer several Zodiac Xyz monsters on top of each other. They gained effects and attack points and all that stuff. Um, so I think the whole idea of like cheating summoning types is something that we have seen a little bit before. Like with Zodiacs, they sort of did this with Xyz monsters, and I would argue that maybe Tri Brigade sort of did it with Link monsters, where they're literally like Link summoning more or less from the by using stuff like in your graveyard as material. So yeah, you can talk about that. And then I also think that a really important thing with Zodiac Trident in particular is that once per turn in either player's turn, you can attach an Xyz material and target a face-up card on the field and destroy it. This was the start of disruption in Yu-Gi-Oh! This, I say start. Yes, I know there are monsters that did this before, but this is like kind of one that popularized it. These monsters that can like they have a quick effect that can just pop a card in the opponent's field like during their turn. It was disruptive because it meant like your opponent really could not easily just make plays. You have to usually get two monsters in the field if you want to make an Xyz monster, a Synchro, and Dryden can pop one of them, which kind of halts your plans and just can make her really tough to deal with. So just something to kind of keep in mind. We see this a lot now. Plenty of boss monsters. Even there's like DPE and all kinds of things really. They can like bounce and pop and stuff. Ultimate Conductor Tyranno, flipping them face down. So this just sort of like keeping that in mind. I'd say like this has a place in starting modern Yu-Gi-Oh as well. Okay, another monster that I think is like not actually all that relevant in the discussion because we already discussed Cleve Towers, but Masterpiece, just this kind of monster that kind of combines like a lot of the best parts of Towers, Cleve Towers, with like Zodiac Trident. So it can be unaffected by the effects of cards of the same type as what you attributed for it, which is like going to be two different things, usually monster and spell or monster and trap. But also, once per turn in either player's turn, you can banish a continuous spell or trap from your grave, which is like not a cost at all in the True Draco deck, and target a card in the field and destroy it. So again, we are getting that disruption mixed with that boss monster that's really hard to deal with. We will see future boss monsters that do similar things. I think of like Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, and there's really all kinds of them. But yeah, so he's banned to this day. Okay, then there's Link monsters. So Link monsters, I think, are one of the ones that there's a lot to be said. I picked Fireball Dragon because it's probably the most infamous one and the earliest one as well. Lots of crazy combos with this card. We don't have to get into it. We already know this thing created extra links, this thing created loops, FTKs, all sorts of stuff. But there's so many Link monsters that you can put in this place. I mean, the ban list has plenty of them that are banned. I think of like this. I think of Summon Sorceress. There's all these things like Topologic Gumblar Dragon, Nightmare Mermaid. Crystron Halka is still here now, and people want that gone. Things like Electromite that managed to get themselves banned, or Vert Anaconda. All the Link 1 monsters that we all know and love. Link monsters, I think the thing that they really introduced for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is probably like the fact that just any monsters can make them. So with Synchros, you've got this whole thing where it's like a tuner and a non-tuner, and you have to add up their levels. Or Xyz monsters are just two monsters, but they have to have the same level. With Firewall Dragon and most Link monsters, it's just like 2+ monsters, or 2 effect monsters, or 2 monsters with a different name. Basically generic effects or generic recipes to make them that is any monster can be linked off. Any warm body on the field represents the ability to turn into another Link monster and therefore like extending a combo. And there were so many link monsters like Halka Fibrax, but also, Isolde comes to mind and that sort of thing, that summon monsters from deck or search things from deck. And there's just so much to say about link monsters. They kind of deserve their own video, but I definitely think that they were a big part. And they also have their own sort of set of mechanics. They can't be face down. They can't be in defense mode. They got these little arrows, all those mechanics. I think the arrows and all that were useful for a period of time. They're obviously not all that relevant today. These days, I think it's just the ones that can spam something out from deck, or just the really powerful Link 4 ones are the only ones that really matter. And I guess like the Link 1s that just let you turn a monster like a Prank Kid into a Meow Meow Mew, or a Dragon monster into Striker Dragon, things like that. Okay, and last but not least, I want to talk about the Omni negates. So, this is Cyber Dragon Infinity. This is not the first monster to have an Omni negate. There were plenty of ones that, came out around this time. This is just the one that I picked because I like Cyber Dragons. But the idea of monsters that have an effect where once per turn, either player's turn, when a card or effect is activated, you can detach and seize material from this, negate the activation, and destroy it. There's plenty of others. There's like Invoked Mechaba. There's Totally Awesome. Those were all kind of released around this time. And of course, today we've just got like, an infinite number of the damn things, right? Maroon's here, Warlord Savage is here. So the idea that monsters can just straight up Omni negate really deprives, I think, counter traps of a lot of their agency. There's very little reason to run them these days, and it just puts a lot of power in the hands of boss monsters. So when you have moved from, the idea of a boss monster that just maybe can't be destroyed by card effects all the way to boss monsters like Firewall or boss monsters like Cyber Dragon Infinity, you can really see how far modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Has come. I think that Omni negates are probably really high up on the tier list of things that define modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And that people maybe don't like about it. But yeah, so I feel like I've gone on long enough. Here's where I kind of pass the question off to you guys. What do you think? When did modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Begin? What are these elements, or what are these time periods, or whatever? Which of them do you consider to be the start of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Or what are the parts of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! That sort of define it that you feel that I missed in this video? Because I'm sure there are plenty. I am looking forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. I'm very tired. It's been over 20 minutes. Okay, I'll see you guys in the next one. Best turn.